Democracy in Conversation.
Welcome back to Democracy in Conversation. And I am so excited today because I have my good friend Kyrstin Dumont. She is our very special guest. And Kyrstin started, actually, it was the Canada 150 celebration where she came to me and we asked you to do a blessing and bring us some Indigenous jingle dancers to be participating in My Canada Day. And she said something to me. You said something really interesting. You said, yeah, I'll do that, but I don't want it to be a one-off. Yeah. I want to have real engagement come out of it. And that's how we started my Indigenous Youth Council, which you were the president of. And yes, you managed to connect me to people and their stories in ways that have really resonated to me to this day. And I know that you've got quite a history of some of the causes that you yourself have supported. So I'm just really thrilled to have Kyrstin here. And I guess I'll just turn it over to you first to introduce yourself.
Of course. So Kyrstin Dumont, Indigenous cause, Kitigan Zibi, Ndojnaba. Kyrstin Dumont is my name. Kitigan Zibi is where my family traditionally comes from, but I was born and raised here in Ottawa, Ontario. And Anita, as you talk about that one-off, I just want to acknowledge how this is exactly how relationships are meant to be built. And I truly see that in our relationship every year, every day, and every moment that we get to spend together. I think about how incredible it is that I've had the opportunity not only to connect with yourself, but so many incredible leaders. I grew up watching my grandfather, Albert Dumont, attend ceremonies, do presentations, give speeches, and create talking circles for people to come together and learn from one another and be alongside each other. So to be able to now offer that myself as a young woman, it just really brings me to such a full circle moment in understanding that it truly is the next generation that picks the torch up and helps to continue the work that the generations before us had started. And I can't wait to see, the many different generations, even who will come after me, and see what they can do and the relationships they can build and the intergenerational change that will occur amongst the many years to come.
And you mentioned your grandfather, who has done significant work in our region around reconciliation, including I know there was quite the effort to rename the parkway. Yes. So maybe can you tell us a little bit about first? Tell us a little bit about your family and about what that means to you and how it motivates you, and then maybe some of the causes and successes that, because I know not everything has been a success, but when there is, I think, we need to learn from it and we need to repeat it. So maybe talk a little bit about your grandfather.
Yeah, definitely. So I come from a very prideful and proud Algonquin Anishinaabe family. However, the things that my grandfather experienced growing up was really filled with racism and discrimination. And as time went on, my grandfather really dedicated his life to ensuring that he could help change society and make it more of an inclusive country for not only his grandkids, but for the 7 generations to come. I think about, as you say, the renaming of the parkway and, leading a parade of, I think it was about 200 people on September 30th, and to walk that Sir John A. Macdonald Parkway and now drive through it today as, Kichi McCann. It's so heartwarming to see that change truly does come from community activism. Yeah. And I think about that every day. The very first opportunity that I had to work alongside my grandfather was actually for Chaudière Falls. Okay. And now you will see some condominiums on top of, those sacred waterways. And as you said earlier, there's some fights that are won and there are some that are lost. And I think about the fight that we took for that sacred site and how it was so important to the host nation and, the nation in which I come from. And unfortunately, there are progression, but there's also pausing in environmental action. And I think that unfortunately that was one pause that we just couldn't continue to push through. But even from those things that we couldn't change, it just makes us so much more motivated to continue to try and create change. And I think that that's the biggest takeaway for me when looking at my family and all that they've done is the attempt, the trying, the continuous motivation and dedication to make the world a better place. My grandfather has, not only led incredible parades and protests and initiatives, but he's also helped to bring so many communities together. So he's actually on his second book right now where he is collaborating with Immaculata High School. So he's bringing Catholic education students into Indigenous poetry and bringing that together to show people that despite our differences, we are very similar, and as we continue to talk about this one nation, we truly have to live in that way. Unfortunately, I was born in a time after the bridges were broken, and throughout these bridges being broken, we now get to live in a time where we are rebuilding them, showing that we don't have to be on a different side from each other, but we can come together. We can be a unified nation like we all dream of and have dreamt of. And it truly is that possible if we continue to lead with love.
And how do you stay motivated? Because the things that you describe, for many people, those things lead to despair or anger. How is it, because you talked about how the struggles and even the failures were the things that motivate you, and that's not always the case. So what is it that keeps you going? What is it that makes you understand that it is worth, like you said, the attempt is worth it? And then, when you do have those successes, those wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the fact that you've persevered.
Exactly.
And, you talked about building the bridges, and I think figuratively and literally, building those bridges. And you need a partner in order to build those bridges, clearly. And that's not always been there either. So how do you when you wake up in the morning, what keeps you going?
That's a really great question. And, sometimes I even battle with that myself, is what does keep me going? What continues to push me? And as I grow and I change, I think that answer will always continue to change. But something that I've really been trying to amplify and remind young Indigenous people about is that as Indigenous people who come from such beautiful communities, we are a nation and a people who carry such hardship and harm due to colonization. We hear the word intergenerational trauma quite frequently within today's society. But what I hope to remind young people of is that as Indigenous people, not only do we hold intergenerational trauma, but we hold intergenerational strength and love as well. And I think it's that intergenerational strength and love that continuously runs through me from my ancestors before me, my grandfather, my Mishomis, my mom, my matriarch, that truly does push me. It continues to remind me that as we see hardship and experience hardship, as long as we continue to lead with love, we will continue to make a better world and a better place. And I know that that's a lot easier said than done. And trust me, when I get into my dark spots, I try to remind myself of that love and that care that I have for my community. Because at the end of the day, if I can't do it as an individual, then we need to do it as a country.
And we can step up for each other as well. And I think what you just described, I can understand why you are seen as a leader in your community, because it's that kind of inspiration that people want to follow. It's that kind, I think that when you see that, when you see someone leading with love, as you said, it makes you want to be better. It makes you want to do the same thing. And we are social beings. And so I think I agree fundamentally that is more powerful. And so and I've seen you also doing things just to help the community understand the the culture and traditions and ways of seeing the world in a different way. And you've talked a lot about, doing things in a good way.
Yeah.
And one of the examples that I really find special is when you did the fashion show. And it was just, it was such an incredible thing, because one thing you said to me, and I'll have you describe it, but one thing that you said to me was that you wanted to redefine the concept of beauty. Yeah. Because, sort of in our modern world, beauty, is that model, right? Yeah. Very tall, usually blonde, incredibly too thin. Yeah. But, that kind of model image of what is beauty. And in this fashion show, it was really showing Indigenous beauty and looking at it differently. And I also noticed the confidence level as the show went on of some of the participants, the models. Tell us what it was. Tell us what made you do that. And what do you think came of that?
Of course. So the show that you are mentioning, I decided to call Community Unity. And Community Unity was titled that because it was truly an opportunity that came to be due to the community around me. And I think about that a lot whenever I envision the next Community Unity. And at the time, I wanted to do it every single year, but I am a very fast-paced person, and sometimes it doesn't always work out that way. However, to be able to offer such an opportunity like that to my peers and other youth within the community was something that I think I didn't expect, the emotion and the impact. I knew that it was going to be an incredible opportunity for them to take part in, but I don't think that I fully understood the impact that it would have on these young people until after I had seen them walk on, the runway, and after they had shared their emotion with me. Because as a young person, I had always wanted to, fit into colonial standards of what beauty was. And because of that, I grew up, very thin, and I had actually entered the modeling industry at 18 years old. And I remember everyone telling me that I was the perfect person to represent my community. And at first, I was very pleased to hear this. Of course, I'm a young woman. But after I started to think deeper into what that meant, I started to understand that not everyone in my community looked how I did at 18, nor do I look like that now. Does that lessen my beauty now as a 25-year-old woman? Absolutely not. No matter how tall I am, how short I am, what color my hair is, what color my eyes are, beauty is everything. Beauty is nothing. Beauty is the world. And I really wanted to amplify that understanding to young people, because I remember growing up within a colonial society wishing I could be more than I was. And for young people to grow up that way, it causes such confidence problems and self-esteem problems. And you're always trying to become what you are not, right? And what I wished someone would have told me as a young person is that there is such beauty in the difference of our communities, of our people. And, when creating this fashion show, I wanted to include designs from all different Indigenous communities. So we had people all the way from up north to New Mexico, to all around Turtle Island and even beyond, to showcase designs that were important to them, important to their communities, elements that they felt empowered by, colors that, reminded them of their spirits. And I remember telling the young people right before they got on stage that this isn't like any other fashion show. You don't have to, smile perfect or pose incredibly or do all these things that you see on, these modeling shows or these runway shows, but it's about whatever makes you feel most confident. If you want to put, an arm up and be strong, put that arm up. If you want to rock out and roll out, do whatever feels most confident and comfortable to you. And you could almost start to see, the first few people come out a little nervous, a little shy.
Yeah, I saw it.
But then as they come out in the second design, it's like a whole new feeling, emotion, and confidence. And, you know, I think what truly brought that for these young people is that this fashion show wasn't in front of millions of people. It wasn't in front of, you know, designers from New York or England or, you know, around the world, but they were doing this and walking in front of people within their own community. Yeah. Leaders like yourself, family members, friends, and people who they could truly be safe around. Yeah. And I think when we merge safety and beauty together, people can feel their most confident. People can feel their most comfortable. And I started to recognize that as I had conversations with so many of these young people who said that they had never felt that way before, that they had never got to wear a one-of-a-kind handmade design, and that they were so grateful for the opportunity. And that's when I started to ask myself, why aren't there more opportunities like this? Yeah. Why aren't there more young people out there trying things like this? And I think back to myself at 18 and how nervous I was to, you know, do a Richard Robertson runway or a Chio Runway for Hope event. And I started to understand that I was so nervous because it wasn't in front of my own people. It was in front of people who didn't understand that we should be decolonizing beauty instead of continuing this box of what colonial beauty is deemed to be. You know, because I think about how there are so many designers who make things for very specific people in very specific sizes. And as I'm sure you saw at my show, there was sizes of all sorts. Yeah. There was beauty of all kinds. And that's the simple, beautiful, amazing thing about that opportunity, is that it was just beauty. It wasn't, you know, Indigenous beauty. It wasn't colonial beauty. It was just beauty. Yeah. And I think that when we start looking at each other that way, we start to take away this negative assumption of what beauty is deemed to be, you know? And I think about even you and I, so different, but so beautiful. And it's just so empowering to look at another woman and see your beauty, see you for who you are. And that's all Indigenous people want. That's all Indigenous youth want, is to be seen for being beautiful because of who they are.
That is so inspiring. And I've never forgotten that day. It was it was eye-opening also for me, because, and I think that this happens for a lot of people who are not Indigenous. You know, my family came to this land. I'm one generation removed. But I think what happens is people think of colonization, and it's this very abstract thing. Yeah. And for a lot of people, they look at it in a sort of linear historical way. Well, colonization happened. It happened 100 and more years ago, or 200 years ago, and it happened and ended. And they don't understand. And when you hear a story like this, like yours, about a young woman who is trying to fit into a colonial mold, and feeling like you're somehow coming short, when actually you're not. You just need to be yourself. That when you talk about colonization, I think it's easier for people to understand when they see the impact that it's having today on today's youth. And I think it's wonderful that you are doing all of this work to try to show and demonstrate what that is. And one of the things that I also found special about that particular event was that it happened at Algonquin College in a space that was specifically, it was federally funded. And I remember when the college came to me asking for funding, they hadn't had Indigenous spaces in mind, even though it's Algonquin College. And so they ended up creating, it's a circular room, and then there's a space outside, and then an outdoor component as well, with, you know, Indigenous motifs all the way through. And you said to me, and it was really interesting to me because I've also seen other events happen there, that when you create the space, people will then fill the space. And that had you not gotten that space for free to be able to do this, it wouldn't have happened. And so you think federal infrastructure money, right? This is a federal program of, I think it was the SIF program or something for colleges and universities. And somehow out of that federal funding for infrastructure, you now have magic and beauty and decolonization coming through that space.
Exactly.
So there is a tie to politics. And I wanted, because this is democracy in conversation.
Yes.
And a lot of what I want to encourage is people who, and a lot of the people I've interviewed, like, it was a struggle. I mean, we've heard from people who spend years trying to achieve their goals, and but they didn't give up, and they do change things by engaging in democracy and politics, by talking to politicians. And I'm sure, I know that you have peers who may think that talking to politicians is not, I don't know, a sellout, or it's not constructive, or even negative. And I really, what would you say to a young person who wants to make change and is a little bit afraid to call up a member of parliament or start a youth council? And I remember that first youth council meeting was, I think it was almost 3 hours, and it was hard. The stories, there was anger there, but just being able to express it, and me hearing it, it was so important to me to understand and hear. For instance, one of the young people, an Inuit young woman, talking about not being able to find a safe place to live. And the work I've done since in trying to create housing, taking those stories and turning that into public policy. But what would you say to a young person who's feeling cynical, who thinks politics doesn't make a difference, or it isn't theirs? It isn't, what would you say to a young person that is maybe thinking about engaging but doesn't know how?
That's a great question. I think that as young people, we get so afraid of kind of like cold calling and just reaching out to folks. Okay. And it's interesting because I'm actually going to tie this into the fashion show we were just talking about. But when preparing for the fashion show, I had to make a lot of really uncomfortable cold calls for funding, for bursaries, even for makeup that was supplied for the event. And as you say, the venue itself, I also had to reach out to Algonquin College for. And there will be some situations even that I've had with politicians who don't necessarily follow up or continue the conversation, or simply just say no because they don't have the time or capacity, right? And what I want to tell young people is that if you are ever in that situation of somebody telling you that they can't make space for you, or they don't have the capacity to work with you, what I would recommend is to always continue. Never allow that one to, even if it's 100 people, never allow them to diminish your stance, or never allow them to diminish your motivation to move forward. And I say that wholeheartedly because had I allowed, whether working with politicians or creating community events, to stop me, then I wouldn't be at tables like this today. And I think about how much progression can come from the simplest conversations. Even as you say, 6 years ago, those conversations led to an even bigger change within our societal ways. And, housing is now being provided. There are opportunities being offered. And simple conversations create so much change. So what I would tell to young people today is to always allow yourself to have the strength to sit at tables that you are invited to. Because had I, even been afraid to sit at these tables, I would not be here today.
And you negotiated your way. I mean,
yes.
I needed something from you. I needed, somebody to do a blessing for my Canada Day. And you said, okay, but I want space at the table. I want this to lead to engagement, not just for yourself, but for other young people. Yeah. So you made that entry point. You opened that door, and I think that is really important because don't wait for people to. As a politician, she's right. I have so many people who want to talk to me, but you really you just struck me so much, and I have learned so much from you, a tremendous amount, and it has changed how I do politics. So I would also say to those young people to persevere and keep trying and make that space, and make us listen, because the fact is it makes us better. It makes all of us better. And I know that we're running out of a little bit of time, but I do want to ask a question, because you came here today with your baby, and you've just recently become a mother.
I did.
And we were having a wonderful conversation just before we started about motherhood and about what this means, and the different way in which Indigenous cultures look at motherhood, and as feminists and as leaders who are career oriented, what we can learn from that. I wonder if you want to reflect a little bit on that.
Of course. I think prior to starting the podcast today, we were having some discussions about just maternal abilities and sometimes maternal restrictions, for women, especially, the generations who came before me. I think that there was kind of a this or that situation. It's your career or it's your family. And the way that I grew up, it was very much community based. Understanding that as Anishinaabe people, as Indigenous people, we're always around community. We're always being cared for by community. It takes a village. And I really wanted to ensure that my daughter knew that when entering this kind of world, because I am also a very career-driven person. And let me tell you, being on maternity leave, I have not stopped working. Yes. I go into schools, I give keynotes, I'm actually working with the OPS at the end of May. And I'm just doing all things all over the place. And I always bring my daughter with me. And
she's here today.
She is here today. And hopefully you guys will be able to see her. As within Anishinaabe culture, and especially the Ottawa area, Algonquin territory, this has always been a matriarchal land. And the matriarchs, are the speakers, the movers, the keepers. And I really wanted to ensure my daughter understood that. And in understanding that comes balance. It's that we don't have to pick or choose, but we just have to be within, be ourselves, be together. So I always have someone just like your staff today helping me out with my daughter.
Exactly, and they're enjoying it, by the way. Yeah, and here she is. And I just want to point out that, you entered the halls of Parliament as a young woman, but you're just a year old and you're already in Parliament right here. So there you go. I mean, it's opening spaces. Yeah. And I have a feeling that this is not the last time we're going to see you in Parliament. We've talked about this, but I really hope one day that you are also going to run. I do see you here in this space, and she can also go. Even who knows? We might be looking at a couple future prime ministers. But, it's a special thing. I think. Tell me why you see places like this as places where you and your daughter belong. What makes you feel that?
Something I will say, Anita, is that it is because of people like you that make me feel included in these places. However, I think when it comes to politics and this building itself, I don't necessarily feel included, but I will always force my inclusion.
Good.
And, I think that as minority groups and people who aren't necessarily welcomed into these spaces historically, that's exactly what we need to do moving forward, is we need to make space for ourselves. We need to sit at these tables. We need to take our power back. And, as my daughter visits your office today, I truly hope that what you say comes to light, and one day she'll be visiting my office here.
Yep. Well, I fully expect that will be the case. This is why we do this podcast, these kind of conversations. And, it really is important that everybody, that this space also has to change to a point where everybody can feel that it is theirs. And this is, I think, one of the beginnings. And I'm so happy that you brought your daughter today. And I really want to thank you and thank those that are watching today, because this is Democracy in Conversation.
Bye, everyone.